Your title is being updated to reflect current organizational structure. It was 8:47 a.m. when she said it. I remember the exact time because the coffee in my cup hadn't cooled yet, and I remember thinking that was strange. Something that important should have taken longer to say. It should have needed more air in the room, but it landed in less than 5 seconds, and then everyone just sat there like nothing had happened. We were in the small conference room on the fourth floor. The one with the crooked blinds nobody ever fixed. Across from me sat Danielle from HR, folder closed, hands folded on top of it like she was holding it shut on purpose. Next to her was Brandon Reyes, the new head of compliance. 34 years old, hired 11 months ago, still smelled like a consulting firm. He didn't look at me either. That part I noticed. Updated. That was the word she used. Not demoted, not restructured, not reassigned. Updated. Like my title was a piece of software running an old version and someone finally got around to patching it. My badge would still work. My desk wouldn't move. My salary, she assured me, would remain the same through my final months. Only the words on the org chart would change. Senior Director of Regulatory Compliance would become Compliance Analyst level III. Same office, same phone extension, different label. I set my cup down slowly. This is 9 weeks before my retirement, I said. Danielle nodded, calm, professional, the way she'd been trained to nod. We understand the timing is sensitive, Michael. That's why we're being transparent with you now. Transparent. Another word doing a lot of work. Brandon finally spoke. He said this aligns your role with how the department is actually operating today. Actually operating. As if the last 29 years had been theoretical. My name is Michael Prescott. I'm 63 years old. I joined the company in 1997 when compliance meant a binder and a fax machine, and I built the department they were now telling me needed to be updated. Every framework, every audit protocol, every regulator relationship, every internal control they now took for granted, I put in place. Some of them I put in place twice because someone above me thought they knew better, and I had to rebuild them after the fines came in. I didn't argue. I want to be clear about that. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't ask why, I didn't demand a review. I just sat there with my hands on the table and let the silence do what silence does in rooms like that. Danielle slid a single sheet across to me. Effective date next Monday. Signature line at the bottom. I looked at the paper for a long moment, not reading it, just looking, because I already knew what it said and I already knew what it meant. It meant my pension calculation would use the new title. It meant the retirement package, the deferred compensation, the exit benefits, the honorary board seat they'd hinted at for 8 years, all of it would be recalculated against a role I'd never actually held. 9 weeks, that's how much runway they needed. 9 weeks of a lower title on the books and the numbers changed for the rest of my life. I've been with this company for 29 years, I said. Quiet even, not a question, just a statement. Danielle offered a small, practiced smile. And we deeply appreciate that contribution, Michael. Contribution, not service, not leadership, contribution. The kind of word you use for someone who dropped a coin in a jar. I nodded once, folded the paper in half, and slid it into my jacket pocket. I didn't sign it, not because I planned to fight, because I wanted to read it again later alone and understand exactly what I was being asked to accept. I walked back to my office the long way. Past the glass wall of the trading floor, past the small kitchen on 4, past the wall of framed certificates that nobody looked at anymore. Half of them had my signature on the back. I didn't stop to look. I just kept walking, same pace as always, same posture. If anyone had seen me in the hallway, they wouldn't have noticed a thing. That's part of the job too, though nobody ever writes it down. My office was on the corner, not because of status, because of noise. Compliance work needs quiet, and the corner office was the only one with 2 solid walls. I sat down, closed the door softly, and looked at the desk. 29 years of files, regulator correspondence, internal memos, audit trails going back to a time when we still printed everything. Most of it was digital now, backed up, indexed, searchable. But the parts that mattered, the parts that made the whole thing actually work, those lived in a different place. Some of them lived in filing cabinets I hadn't opened in years. Some of them lived only in my head. I pulled the folded paper out of my pocket and set it on the desk. Didn't open it. Just let it sit there, like a small quiet thing that could grow if I let it. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the department's active matter list. 47 open items. 12 of them were what I'd call load-bearing, meaning if they weren't handled correctly in the next quarter, the company would either lose an audit, lose a license, or lose a relationship with a regulator that had taken me a decade to build. Of those 12, 9 had my name as the responsible party. Not co-responsible, not oversight, sole responsible, because at some point along the way, everyone else who understood them had left, retired, or been reorganized out. Brandon knew about maybe 4 of them. I'd walked him through the framework in his first month. He'd taken notes, asked good questions, then never followed up. That wasn't unusual. New heads of compliance rarely follow up. They present, they restructure, they align. But the actual work, the quiet correspondence with a state banking regulator who remembers you by first name, the phone call at 6 p.m. on a Thursday when a filing deadline gets moved without warning, the instinct that tells you a footnote in a rule proposal is going to become an enforcement priority in 18 months, that work doesn't transfer through a slide deck. It transfers through time, and there wasn't any left. I closed the laptop and sat back. 9 weeks. That was the horizon now. 9 weeks until my last day, and somewhere inside those 9 weeks was the reason they'd chosen this exact moment to change my title. Because it wasn't random. Nothing in a compliance department is ever random. If they'd wanted to update the title honestly, they would have done it 2 years ago when Brandon was hired, or last quarter during the reorganization, or next January when the fiscal year reset. They chose now because now was the only window where the change would count against my retirement math, but wouldn't give me time to formally contest it through the internal review process. 60 days. That's how long the appeals process took, and I had less than that left on the payroll. Somebody had run the numbers. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Somebody had sat in a room, probably with a spreadsheet, and calculated exactly how many days they needed the new title in effect to shift the pension formula into a different bracket. Then they'd built a calendar backward from that number, and last Monday's meeting was the answer. I picked up the folded paper and put it back in my jacket. Then I stood up, opened the door, and walked out to get another cup of coffee, because that's what I always did at 9:15. Nothing about my routine was going to change today. That would come later. The break room was empty when I got there. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. I poured a fresh cup, added nothing, and stood there for a moment looking out the small window at the parking lot. Cars in their usual spots. Same delivery truck at the loading dock. Same view I'd had for 29 years. Different feeling, though, not worse. Just different, like standing in a room you've lived in your whole life and noticing for the first time that the floor slopes. On the way back, I passed Brandon's office, door open as it always was. He was on a call, gesturing at his screen, saying something about frameworks and alignment. He didn't see me. I didn't slow down, but in the 2 seconds it took to walk past his door, I saw what was on his second monitor. It was a draft org chart, and my name wasn't on it. Not in the new title, not in the old one, not anywhere. Just a clean box where my position used to be, already labeled with someone else's name. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone external. That was the second piece of information I collected that morning. The first was the timing. The second was the replacement. And the two of them together told me something I hadn't understood in the conference room. The title change wasn't just about my pension. It was about the story they wanted to be able to tell later. If I retired as senior director, the person replacing me would have to be brought in at that level, with that authority, with that access. If I retired as a compliance analyst, level III, they could restructure the entire top of the department without ever having to explain what happened to the previous senior director. Because on paper, there wouldn't have been one. Not at the end. I got back to my office, closed the door again, and sat down, set the coffee on the coaster. Same coaster I'd had for 12 years, a small ceramic thing my daughter made in a pottery class. I looked at it for a second longer than I usually did. Then I opened my laptop and started working, not on the 47 active matters, on something else. I opened a blank document and started listing, not files, not procedures, relationships, every regulator I had a direct line to, every examiner who trusted me by name, every state office that had my cell number in case something urgent came in after hours, every industry contact, every peer at other firms, every former colleague now at an agency or a regulator or a law firm. I wasn't writing it down to take with me. I was writing it down because I needed to see it, because I needed to understand exactly what was about to walk out the door and whether anyone else in the building understood it too. The list took me 40 minutes. When I was done, it was 3 pages long, single-spaced. And of those 3 pages, maybe 4 names were also known to Brandon. Maybe 2 were known to anyone in HR. The rest were mine, not because I had hoarded them, because relationships in this business don't scale through org charts. They scale through years. And I had years. Nobody else in the building did. I saved the document to a folder on my personal drive and closed it. Then I opened my calendar and looked at the next 9 weeks. Meetings, filings, 1 regulator visit in week 4, an internal audit review in week 6, and a scheduled transition sit-down with Brandon in week 7. Week 7, 2 weeks before my last day. That was the window they'd built for the handoff. 2 weeks to transfer 29 years. I closed the calendar. Then I picked up the phone and made the first call. The first call was to a woman named Patricia Hollies. She'd been a senior examiner at the state regulator for 18 years, and she'd known me for 16 of them. Not socially, professionally. But in this business, 16 years of professional trust is closer to family than most people understand. When her office had questions about our filings, she called me. When we had questions about interpretation, I called her. Not through the general line. Direct. That's how it had worked since 2010, and it had worked because both of us treated the arrangement with the seriousness it deserved. "Patricia, it's Michael," I said when she picked up. There was a small pause, then her voice warmed. "Michael, it's been a few weeks. Everything all right? Everything's fine," I said. "I wanted to give you a heads up on something. My retirement date is set, 9 weeks out." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're really doing it." I'd been telling her for 2 years it was coming, but she'd never quite believed me. Nobody who works in this world quite believes anyone actually leaves it. "I'm really doing it," I said. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly, and I wanted to make sure you knew who to contact after I'm gone." That was the sentence that mattered, not the retirement announcement, the handoff. Because in her world, in the world of examiners and regulators and enforcement staff, the question of who to contact isn't a formality. It's the entire relationship. And if I didn't name someone, she'd draw her own conclusions about what that meant. "Who should I be routing things to?" she asked. I paused for exactly the right length of time. Then I said, "That's still being determined internally. I'll follow up with you when I have a name I can stand behind. I'll stand behind." 4 words. Nothing hostile in them, nothing accusatory, just the truth delivered plainly. Patricia understood. She'd been in this business long enough to hear what wasn't being said. "I appreciate that, Michael," she said. "And when you have that name, I'd like a proper introduction, not just an email, a call with you on it." "Of course," I said. "That's how I do it." We talked for another 2 minutes about nothing in particular, and then I hung up. I made 4 more calls that morning. Same script, roughly, same tone. Same careful sentence about who to contact. Each of them heard what I wasn't saying, and each of them responded the same way. They wanted a proper introduction. They wanted my endorsement. They wanted to know the replacement was someone I trusted, because their trust in the company had for a long time now been rooted through me. That wasn't ego. That was just the structure of the thing. Regulators don't trust institutions. They trust people. And the people they trusted at this firm were a very short list. By 11 o'clock, 5 of the most important external relationships the company had were now aware that I was leaving, that no successor had been named, and that any name eventually offered would need to pass through my introduction to be taken seriously. I hadn't said a single negative thing about the company. I hadn't warned anyone. I hadn't leaked anything. I had done exactly what a departing senior director is supposed to do. I had given professional notice to my external counterparts in the professional manner appropriate to their level. Nothing more, but nothing less either. Because the version of me that would have handled this 2 years ago, or 5, or 10, would have made those same calls with a successor's name already in hand, would have set up the introduction meetings before making the announcement, would have smoothed the transition so completely that the regulator on the other end wouldn't have felt a single bump. That version of me had done that work for 29 years. This version was going to do exactly what the job description said. Nothing more. At noon, I ate lunch at my desk. Same sandwich I always got from the deli across the street, same bottle of water, same 20 minutes. While I ate, I opened the folded paper from my jacket and read it properly for the first time. It was 1 page, 3 paragraphs. The language was careful, the way HR language always is. Nothing that could be quoted back in a lawsuit. Nothing that could be waived in front of a judge as evidence of anything specific. Just the word update 3 times and the phrase organizational alignment twice, and a signature line at the bottom with today's date already printed. I noticed something on the second read that I'd missed the first time. The document didn't just change my title, it changed my reporting line. As senior director, I'd reported directly to the general counsel. As compliance analyst level III, I would report to Brandon. That meant for the last 9 weeks of my career on paper, I would be Brandon's subordinate, which meant Brandon would sign my final performance review, which meant Brandon would be listed in the internal record as my supervisor at the time of retirement, which meant that if anyone ever asked in a deposition, in a regulatory inquiry, in a lawsuit who had been running compliance in my final months, the answer on the org chart would be Brandon, not me. I set the sandwich down and read the paragraph again. It wasn't sloppy drafting. It was deliberate. Somebody wanted the record to show that Brandon had been in charge during a specific window, and that window included at least 2 filings I was already worried about. One was a quarterly report due in week 5 of my remaining 9. The other was a response to a regulator inquiry that had come in 3 weeks ago, one that Brandon had been copied on but hadn't opened, at least not that I could see from the shared folder logs. I finished the sandwich slowly. Not because I was hungry anymore, because I needed the routine. Because when your day starts to reveal itself as something other than what you thought it was, the small anchors matter. The sandwich, the coffee, the pottery coaster, the corner office with its 2 solid walls. All of it kept my hand steady while my head worked. At 12:45, I closed the document and put it back in my jacket. Then I did something I hadn't done in about 11 years. I opened the personnel file on myself. It was a benefit of being senior enough in compliance that I had access to my own HR record. Most employees didn't. I scrolled through the entries slowly. Hire date, promotions, salary adjustments, performance reviews. Every review from the last 29 years was there, and every one of them was rated at the top of the scale. Not one meets expectations. Not one exceeds. Every single one was the top tier, whatever the language happened to be that year. Outstanding, exceptional, top performer, distinguished contributor. 29 consecutive years. Then I scrolled to the most recent entry. It had been added 3 days ago, 3 days before this morning's meeting. It was a note, filed by Brandon, marked as a preliminary performance observation. It said that my engagement with departmental modernization initiatives had been limited, and that my knowledge transfer to junior staff had not met the standards expected of senior leadership in the transition period. It was 2 sentences long. It hadn't been discussed with me. It hadn't been shared with me. It had simply been added 3 days ago, and it would now sit in my file as the most recent characterization of my work. I read it twice. Then I closed the file. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't print it. I didn't need to. I would remember every word of it for the rest of my life, and that was enough for what came next. At 1:30, Brandon knocked on my door. He didn't wait for me to answer. He rarely did. He came in with his laptop under his arm and that easy expression he wore when he wanted something from you but didn't want to look like he was asking. "Michael, got a minute?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat, opened the laptop, and set it on his knees. "Just wanted to touch base on the transition plan," he said. "Danielle mentioned you met this morning. Touch base." Another one of his phrases. I noticed how he framed it, though. Danielle mentioned we met. as if he hadn't been in the room, as if he hadn't sat 2 feet away from her with his hands folded and his eyes on the wall. I nodded once. "We met," I said. He waited a beat, expecting me to say more. I didn't. He shifted in the chair. "Look, I know the timing feels awkward, but I want to make sure we use these next 9 weeks well. I've been thinking about how to structure the handoff." Structure. I almost smiled. Instead, I said, "What did you have in mind?" He opened a document on his screen and turned the laptop so I could see. It was a transition plan, bullet points, timelines, deliverables. Week 1, knowledge transfer sessions. Week 2, shadowing on active matters. Week 3, transfer of regulator contact list. Week 4, and so on. It was a competent-looking document, the kind a consulting firm would produce, and it had almost nothing to do with what the actual work required. I looked at it for about 10 seconds. Then I said, "This is a good framework." He brightened a little. "Great. I was hoping we could start the knowledge transfer sessions this week, maybe tomorrow morning. I want to get ahead of the curve, ahead of the curve." I nodded slowly. "Brandon," I said, "I want to be helpful here. And I will be, but I need to understand something first. What's my role for the next 9 weeks? On paper, I mean. Because the document Danielle gave me this morning changes my title and my reporting line, and I want to make sure we're both operating from the same understanding of what I'm authorized to do." He blinked. It was a small blink, but I saw it. Then he recovered. "Your role is essentially the same, Michael. The title change is administrative. Nothing about your day-to-day responsibilities changes." I let that sit in the air for a moment. Then I said, "So I still have signing authority on regulatory correspondence." He hesitated. "Well, technically, under the new structure, that authority would sit with me. But operationally, of course, you'd continue drafting and I'd sign off." I nodded again. "And my access to the examiner portal, that would also transfer to me," he said. "But you'd retain read access." Read access. I let that one sit too. "So for the next 9 weeks," I said, "I would be drafting regulatory correspondence for your signature, transferring my contacts to you, and operating with read-only access to the systems I've maintained for 29 years. Is that a fair summary?" He shifted again. "When you put it that way, it sounds harsher than it is. Michael, this is standard transition practice. It's how we onboard new leadership." "I'm not being harsh," I said. "I'm being precise. It's a habit, comes with the job." He closed the laptop slowly. "Look," he said, "I know this is a lot to process, but I need you engaged in this transition. Otherwise, we're going to have gaps." I looked at him for a long moment, then I said, "I understand. I'll be at the knowledge transfer session tomorrow morning. Just send me the calendar invite." He stood up, relieved, and thanked me and left. I watched him go. Then I turned back to my screen and opened a new document. I titled it Transition Log, and I started writing. The transition log wasn't for them. It was for me. Every meeting I had with Brandon, every question he asked, every answer I gave, every document I shared, and every one I didn't, all of it went into that log. Date, time, subject, exact language when it mattered. Not because I was building a case. Because I'd spent 29 years watching what happens to people who don't keep records, and I wasn't going to be one of them in my final 9 weeks. The next morning at 9, I sat down with Brandon in the small conference room on 4. He had his laptop, a fresh notebook, and a coffee. I brought a legal pad and a pen. "No laptop," he noticed. "Old school today," he said, smiling. I smiled back. "Habit," I said. "I remember things better when I write them down." That wasn't entirely true. I remembered things fine either way. But a legal pad in front of you changes the tone of a meeting. It slows people down, it makes them careful, and I wanted him careful. We spent 2 hours on the first knowledge transfer session. I walked him through 3 of the 12 load-bearing matters, not the most critical 3. The 3 I'd already documented most thoroughly in the shared system. Everything I told him was already written down somewhere he had access to. I wasn't withholding. I was simply not adding. When he asked follow-up questions, I answered them accurately and completely within the scope of what he'd asked. I didn't volunteer the next layer. I didn't say, "And here's the thing you should really be worried about," because he hadn't asked. And my job, as he had described it yesterday, was to support his transition, not to lead it. By the end of the 2 hours, he was pleased. He said so. "This is great, Michael. Really helpful. I think we're going to be in good shape." I nodded. "I'm glad it was useful," I said. "Same time tomorrow?" He said yes. I wrote it in my legal pad and drew a small line under it. Then I went back to my office and opened the transition log and typed up everything from the meeting, every question he'd asked, every answer I'd given, every follow-up he hadn't asked. That last column was the important one. I called it not covered. And by the end of that first session, the not covered column already had 11 entries. Over the next 2 weeks, we had 6 more sessions. Same pattern, he asked questions. I answered exactly what he asked. The not covered column grew. By the end of week 2, it was 43 entries long. 43 specific issues, relationships, precedents, or procedural nuances that Brandon had not asked about, that I had not volunteered, and that would matter in the next 12 months. I knew this because I'd made the calendar of what was coming. Every one of those 43 items had a date on it. A filing deadline, an examination window, a rule proposal comment period, a scheduled examiner rotation. Real dates, real consequences. In week 3, something small happened that told me the picture was already shifting. Patricia Hollies called me directly, not through the general line, direct to my cell. "Michael," she said, "I got an email from someone named Brandon Reyes yesterday. He introduced himself as the new head of compliance and asked if we could set up a call. I hadn't heard from you yet, so I wanted to check in." I closed my office door. "Patricia," I said, "I appreciate you calling. Brandon is the new head of compliance. That part is accurate, but I haven't made the formal introduction yet, and I'd prefer to do that in the proper way before you take his meeting. Would you be willing to hold off until I can arrange it?" She said, "Of course." And then she said something else. "Michael, is everything all right there?" I took a breath before I answered. Not a long one, just enough to make sure the next words were the right ones. "Patricia," I said, "I'm going to answer that honestly but carefully." She waited. "That's a professional courtesy," I said, "so let me be clear about what I can and can't say. I'm not going to characterize internal decisions, and I'm not going to speak against the company. I've been here 29 years and that's not who I am." "Understood," she said. "I trust you." I chose the next sentence with all the care I had. "What I can tell you," I said, "is that the transition timeline is compressed, and the handoff of external relationships hasn't been coordinated with me in the way I would have coordinated it if the decision were mine. I would ask you as a personal favor to route any substantive matters through me for the remainder of my time here. After that, I'll make the introductions I can stand behind." There was a pause. Then Patricia said, "That's what I needed to know." And she said it in a voice I'd heard exactly twice in 16 years, both times when she'd told me an examination was about to move in a direction the company wouldn't like. We ended the call politely. I hung up and sat still for a long time. Because I understood what had just happened. Patricia was going to slow down, not obstruct, not escalate, just slow down. She was going to require more documentation than usual. She was going to ask for confirmation she didn't normally ask for. She was going to treat every piece of correspondence from Brandon as if it were coming from a stranger, because functionally it was. And Patricia wasn't the only examiner I'd made a version of that call to. There were 4 others. And they were all going to do the same thing in their own ways for their own reasons, without any of them coordinating with each other. Because that's how professional trust works. It doesn't need coordination. It just needs to be withdrawn quietly at the same time by people who have known each other for a long time. The following Monday, week 4, the first crack appeared. Brandon came into my office at 10:15. He didn't knock. He looked pale. "Michael," he said, "do you have a minute?" I gestured to the chair. He sat down heavily. "I just got a call from the state banking regulator," he said. "They're moving up the examination window. They want to start next month instead of next quarter. And they're asking for documentation on 12 open matters, including the 3 we talked about in our first session." I nodded slowly. "That's earlier than expected," I said. "Any reason given?" He shook his head. "Just that they want to align their calendar, but it feels like more than that. I've been trying to reach my counterpart there for 2 weeks and she hasn't returned my calls." "Who's your counterpart?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Patricia Hollies," he said. I nodded again. "I've worked with Patricia for a long time," I said. "She's thorough. If she's moving up the window, she has a reason. Do you want me to reach out?" Something flickered across his face. Relief, mostly. And under it, something more complicated. Yes, he said, please. That would be helpful. I said I would. He thanked me, stood up and left. I watched him go. Then I opened the transition log and typed the entry. Date, time, subject. Under not covered, I added one more line. Item 44, examiner rotation risk unaddressed. I didn't call Patricia. I didn't need to. She'd already told me what she was going to do. What I did instead was open my calendar and look at week 5. The quarterly filing was due on Wednesday, and Brandon hadn't asked me a single question about it. Wednesday came. The filing went out at 4:47 p.m. Brandon signed it. His name, his title, his authority. I had drafted the document as we'd agreed. I had drafted it accurately and completely, based on the information I had access to. What I had not done was flag the 2 footnotes that would, in the next examination cycle, become the questions Patricia's team would ask first. Because Brandon hadn't asked me what to flag, he'd asked me to draft the filing, and I had drafted the filing, exactly as requested, nothing more. Thursday morning, I came in and found an email in my inbox from Danielle. She wanted to schedule a follow-up meeting about my transition plan. Nothing urgent, she wrote. Just wanted to make sure we're aligned on the final weeks. Aligned. I read the email twice, then replied and accepted the meeting for Friday afternoon. Then I went back to my legal pad and my transition log and my 44th not covered entry, and I kept working. By Friday morning, the crack had widened. 2 more regulators had, by their own timelines and for their own stated reasons, requested earlier documentation or additional confirmations on matters they had previously been comfortable with. None of them cited me. None of them cited Brandon. They cited internal calendar changes, administrative reviews, standard procedural updates. All of it looked routine on paper. All of it was arriving at the same desk at the same time, and that desk belonged to Brandon. He came to see me at 11. He didn't sit down this time. Michael, he said, standing in my doorway with his hand on the frame, something's happening. I can feel it, but I can't see it. I looked up from my legal pad. What are you seeing? He listed it. The examination window, the documentation requests, a call from a state agency he hadn't heard from in 6 months, an email from a federal counterpart asking politely but pointedly for a status update on a matter he hadn't known was still open. He said none of these are emergencies individually, but all of them together in the same week. I don't know what to do with that. I set my pen down. Brandon, I said, in this business, that's what a problem looks like before it's a problem. It's never one thing, it's the pattern. He nodded slowly. He was starting to understand something, not everything, but something. What would you do? He asked. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said I'd call each of them personally. Not email, call. I'd introduce myself properly, acknowledge that there's been a leadership transition, and ask them directly what they need from you to feel confident in the relationship going forward. And I'd do it this week, not next. He wrote that down. Would you be willing to be on those calls with me? He asked, and there it was. The question I'd been waiting for since the meeting on the 4th floor 9 days ago. The question that meant he finally understood what he was standing on. I looked at him. Brandon, I said, my title changed last week. My reporting line changed. My signing authority changed. On paper, I'm a compliance analyst, level III. I can be on those calls in that capacity if you'd like. But I can't be on them as senior director because I'm not one anymore. Do you want me on the calls in the capacity I currently hold? He stood there in the doorway for what felt like a long time. Then he said quietly, I'll talk to Danielle. I nodded once. Let me know, I said. He left. I turned back to my legal pad. My afternoon meeting with Danielle was still on the calendar. And now, for the first time in 9 days, I had a reasonably good idea of what she was going to want to talk about. Danielle's office was on 5. Same neutral chairs, same clean table, same crooked blinds nobody ever fixed. She was already sitting when I came in. Brandon was there too. So was the general counsel, a woman named Rebecca Vance, who I'd worked with for 11 years and respected without qualification. She was the one who spoke first. Michael, thank you for making time. I set my legal pad on the table and sat down. Of course, I said. Rebecca folded her hands. We've been reviewing the transition timeline, she said, and in light of some developments this week, we'd like to revisit the title change. Effective immediately, we're rescinding the update. Your title as Senior Director of Regulatory Compliance will remain in effect through your retirement date. Your reporting line will return to me. Your signing authority is restored. I looked at her. I didn't say anything yet. She continued. We'd also like to discuss extending your involvement in the regulator relationships for a period after your retirement in an advisory capacity if that would be something you'd consider. Compensated separately from your pension. Danielle didn't speak. Brandon didn't speak. Rebecca had come alone into a room she was going to have to leave alone. I appreciated that. I took a moment. Then I said, Rebecca, I want to be direct with you and I want to be direct with everyone here. The title change wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Someone in this room, or someone reporting to someone in this room, ran the numbers on my pension and built a 9-week window. I know that. You know that. And now we're going to have a conversation where none of us say it out loud, and that's fine. That's professional. But I need us all to understand that I understand. Rebecca held my eyes. She didn't flinch. Understood, she said. I nodded. I'll accept the restoration of the title, I said. It's the right thing to do, and it protects the company more than it protects me at this point. I'll finish the 9 weeks. I'll make the introductions to the regulators properly, on calls with me on the line, and I'll stand behind Brandon in those introductions to the extent I can honestly do so, which will require him and me to have some longer conversations than we've had so far. Brandon nodded, looking at the table. As for the advisory role, I said, I appreciate the offer. I'll consider it and give you an answer within a week. But I want to be clear that my answer is going to depend on whether we can build something honest, not something that papers over what happened this month. Rebecca said, that's fair. We ended the meeting shortly after. I walked back to my office and sat down at my desk. The pottery coaster was still there, the legal pad, the transition log, 44 not covered entries, all of which I would now in the remaining weeks actually cover, because the deal had changed. And because I was, in the end, the person I'd been for 29 years, and that person didn't leave a system exposed when he'd been given his title back. 9 weeks later, I retired. Properly. With the title I'd earned, the pension I'd earned, and the introductions I'd been able to make in good conscience. The advisory role I did accept in a limited form for 1 year. Brandon kept his job. He grew into it, more or less. Patricia and I still exchange Christmas cards. And what I learned in those 9 weeks wasn't about revenge and it wasn't about winning. It was simpler than that. When an institution decides what you're worth, they're telling you what they can afford to lose. Sometimes the only useful thing you can do is show them, quietly and without cruelty, what that number actually is. Then let them do the math. Subscribe, like, and share. Peace.